sit before me, and I feel the weight of your silence. There is a stillness in the air, the kind of silence that comes not from peace but from exhaustion, as though you have carried too much for too long. I must speak to that silence. I must speak to the wound that is hidden beneath your gentleness, to the tremor of your soul that others cannot see, to the shadow you dare not name, for this is the plight of the empath, the one who absorbs, who feels, who bends, until bending becomes breaking. And it is of such a breaking that I must tell you tonight, the day the empath snaps. You see, the empath does not live as others do. Most walk through the world as though it were solid, external, separate from themselves. But the empath carries no such separation. They live in a state of porous being, absorbing the moods of the room, the rage of the stranger, the despair of the lover, the ache of the parent, the hunger of the child. Their psyche is like a mirror made of water. Every ripple from outside disturbs their own reflection. And so the empath carries in their body what does not belong to them. Grief, terror, resentment, shame. All of it seeps in a stream that never stops flowing. And they call it compassion. They call it love. They call it being good. But it is also a slow suicide of the soul. Now imagine this. Year upon year of silent absorption. The empath says nothing, because to speak feels like betrayal. They endure because to withdraw feels like cruelty. They bend because to resist feels like violence. But beneath this compliance, another figure grows. It is the shadow, the part of the psyche that gathers everything rejected and unspoken, every swallowed word, every hidden rage, every secret boundary never set. All of it gathers in the dark. The empath, who appears angelic in the daydreams of destruction at night, the smile conceals the scream, and in the unconscious, a force is building until one day the balance breaks and the empath snaps. When I speak of snapping, I do not mean a simple loss of temper. I mean a psychic rupture, a terrifying emergence of what has been repressed for decades. I mean the eruption of the shadow, the unleashing of the archetypal force that has been chained too long. It is like a dam that bursts, flooding the village below, sweeping away the houses, drowning the fields. Those who loved the empath the most are stunned to find themselves the first to drown in this flood. For they never imagined that gentleness could turn to fury, that kindness could wear the mask of vengeance. Yet this too is human, and I must tell you, it is archetypal, inevitable, and profoundly dangerous if misunderstood. I once treated such a case, and it is seared into my memory as one of the most terrifying lessons of my work. She was a woman in her late 30s, known by all as a saintly figure. From childhood she had been called sensitive, tender-hearted, incapable of harm. She cared for her ailing parents, for neighbors in distress, for strangers on the street. She worked as a nurse, tending to wounds both physical and invisible. But in the depths of her dreams, a different figure lived. She dreamed of wolves with red eyes tearing at the throats of her loved ones. She dreamed of fire sweeping through her childhood home. She dreamed of herself standing on a cliff, screaming until the earth split open. When she came to me, her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the pressure of something locked inside her for too long. Her snapping came suddenly one evening after years of caring for a demanding, ungrateful mother. She found herself unable to rise from her chair. She heard her mother calling, as she had done 1,000 times, but something within her rebelled. A voice, ancient and cold, spoke from the depths of her psyche. No more. And with those words, the persona she had worn, the mask of the dutiful daughter, the saintly nurse, shattered. She left her mother's house that night and did not return. In the weeks that followed, her family and colleagues were horrified to see a different woman emerge, sharp-tongued, defiant, unwilling to give. They called her cruel, selfish, even insane. But I knew what I was seeing. The shadow unchained. The empath had snapped. The terror of this snapping is not only for those around the empath, but for the empath themselves. Imagine living your whole life identified with the archetype of the caregiver, the savior, the one who never harms, to suddenly feel the flood of rage, to taste the desire to destroy, is to feel possessed by a demon. Yet this demon is no foreign entity. It is their own soul, disowned, genuine, hidden in the unconscious until it could no longer be silenced. The snapping, then, is not madness. It is revelation, but revelation is often terrifying because it strips away the illusions by which we lived. What we must understand here is the archetypal pattern. The empath is drawn to the archetype of the healer, the mother, the Christ-like sufferer who carries the sins of the world. But no archetype is complete without its shadow. The mother who nurtures also devours. As the myth of the terrible mother reveals, the healer who saves also wounds, for to touch another's soul is to wield the power of life and death. The Christ who redeems also descends into hell, for redemption is not possible without the confrontation with the underworld. And so the empath who lives only in light is doomed to be overtaken by the darkness they deny. Their snapping is the eruption of the archetype's shadow, the moment when the devouring mother, the wounding healer, the wrathful Christ steps forth. You may ask, is this snapping necessary? Must the empath always break? I will tell you this. What is not integrated will eventually erupt. The snapping is the psyche's last resort, the violent compensation for years of repression. But there is another way. If the empath learns to see their shadow, to recognize their own capacity for anger, for cruelty, for refusal, then they need not wait for the snapping. They can live more wholly, more truthfully, without destroying themselves or others. But this requires immense courage, for it means looking at the wolf in the mirror and admitting, this too is me. How? I return to the woman's case. After her snapping, after the storm of accusations and judgments from those around her, she entered into a deep analysis. We spoke not only of her dreams, but of her fantasies of violence, her longing for freedom, her resentment toward those she had cared for. Slowly, she began to see that what she had called evil in herself was not evil, but the unlived part of her soul. She began to set boundaries, to say no without guilt, to let others feel their own pain without rushing to absorb it. And in time, her dreams changed. The wolves no longer tore at throats, but stood by her side as guardians. The fire no longer destroyed her home, but lit the hearth of a new house she built for herself. She had not eliminated her shadow, but integrated it. And in doing so, she was no longer haunted by the fear of snapping again. This is why I tell you, the snapping of the empath is terrifying. Yes, but it is also a gateway. It is the psyche's brutal initiation into wholeness. To witness it is to witness the raw power of the unconscious breaking through the fragile structures of persona. To experience it is to feel both the terror of possession and the possibility of rebirth. The snapping is a threshold. On one side lies the false self of endless giving. On the other side lies the true self, capable of both compassion and rage, both light and darkness. To cross that threshold is to become human in the fullest sense. And yet, I must warn you, not all who snap survive the crossing. Some drown in the flood of their own repressed rage. Some lash out so violently that they destroy relationships beyond repair. Some, unable to reconcile the shadow with their self-image, fall into psychosis. That is why we must not romanticize the empath snapping as though it were liberation alone. It is dangerous. It is sacred. It is fire, and fire can burn as easily as it can purify. The snapping of the empath is not simply a personal drama. It is a mythic enactment. When I speak of myth, I do not mean a fanciful tale, but the eternal patterns of the psyche that repeat in every age. To understand the empath's breaking point, we must turn to the ancient stories, for they reveal what our modern language often conceals. In myth, the empath is the sacrificial figure, the one offered again and again to appease the hunger of the gods or the rage of the tribe. They are like Prometheus, chained to the rock, giving his liver day after day to the eagle's beak. They are like Inanna, descending into the underworld, stripping away every garment, every protection, until they stand naked before the Queen of Death. They are like Christ, bearing the cross not of their own making. Pierced by wounds that belong to the world, these myths live within the empaths unconsciously, compelling them to endure more than others, to identify with suffering as though it were sacred duty. But myths are never one-sided. Every savior carries a shadow of vengeance. Prometheus, though chained, secretly scorns the gods. Inanna, though stripped, returns from the underworld with the power to overthrow Christ himself, though forgiving. Speaks of the sword, speaks of turning over the tables, speaks of fire that divides. The empath snapping is the eruption of this other half of the myth, the shadow side of the archetype that demands recognition. When the empath breaks, they become the destroyer as well as the healer, the devourer as well as the mother, the rebel as well as the savior. This is why those who witness it are so terrified. It is as though a saint suddenly speaks with the voice of a demon. But in truth, it is the archetype completing itself. Let us consider the dreams that accompany this snapping. Dreams, after all, are the royal road to the unconscious. Before the empath breaks, Their dreams are often filled with symbols of containment, rooms too small, floods rising, animals trapped. They dream of trying to hold together what cannot be held, of carrying bundles that grow heavier with every step. These are images of the psyche straining under the weight of repression. When the snapping draws near, the imagery shifts. Fire à pair. Floods break forth. Wild animals escape their cages. They dream of screaming until mountains crumble, of running naked through cities, of blood covering their hands. Such images terrify the conscious ego, which insists, I am kind, I am gentle, I do not harm. But the unconscious insists otherwise. The empath is also rage, also desire, also destruction. The dreams are warnings, and if unheeded, they become reality in the snapping. You may recall the case of my patient, the nurse who cared endlessly for her mother. In her last year, before the rupture, she dreamed repeatedly of standing in a cathedral, the pews filled with silent faces. She would begin to sing, but her voice grew louder and louder until the stained glass windows shattered. In one dream, she saw the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ, but the Madonna's face twisted into a skull and the child dissolved into ash. These are archetypal images. The shattered cathedral was her own soul, tired of holy silence, demanding a scream that could no longer be contained. The Madonna's skull revealed the terrible mother, the devouring archetype hidden within the nurturing one, and the dissolving child was the image of her self-sacrifice. Heure perpétuale infantile, duty, dying at last. These dreams were terrifying to her, but to me they were the prophecy of her snapping. The unconscious always knows what the conscious denies. There is an alchemical dimension here as well. In alchemy, we speak of the nigredo, the blackening, the stage when all that was pure is dissolved into darkness. For the empaths, the snapping is their nigredo. It is the moment when their persona of light collapses, when they are plunged into the black fire of their own shadow. It feels like death, and indeed it is a kind of death, the death of the false self that lived only for others. But from nigredo arises albedo, the whitening, the possibility of new integration. Yet, this whitening does not come automatically. One must remain in the fire, not flee from it, not deny it, not project it onto others. To stay with the terror of the snapping is to allow the shadow to be transmuted into power, into authenticity, into wholeness. This is the alchemical task of the empath who snaps, not to destroy themselves or others, but to let the fire consume the illusion and reveal the gold hidden in the ashes. You may wonder why the empath suffers this fate so intensely. Why must their snapping be so violent, so archetypal, so terrifying? The answer lies in their original wound. Empathy at its root is not merely a gift. It is often a survival strategy. The child who grows up in a volatile home learns to feel every shift in mood, every hidden tension, every unspoken rage. They become hyper-attuned because their safety depends on it. To survive, they learn to carry the emotions of others, to soothe, to absorb, to anticipate. And so the empathic adult is often the child who never ceased being the emotional container of the family. Their giving is born of necessity, not choice. But the psyche cannot forever live in this imbalance. What was once survival becomes prison. And so the snapping comes as the psyche's demand for liberation from an ancient wound. It is the moment when the child's adaptive mask crumbles and the repressed rage of a lifetime bursts forth. In one seminar, I spoke of the archetype of the pura aeternus, the eternal child. Many empaths are trapped in this archetype, for they live always as children in relation to the demands of others. They obey, they please, they long for approval, they fear abandonment. Their goodness is a bargain struck with the gods of childhood. If I am good, I will be loved, but no bargain holds forever. The snapping is the moment the eternal child refuses the pact. It is the roar of the child who has been silenced too long, the storming of the gates of heaven, the revolt against the parent in the God, the world. This revolt terrifies them, for it feels like blasphemy. But it is also initiation. To grow from child to adult, one must snap the chains of the old contract, even if it means being called selfish, cruel, unrecognizable. The snapping is the soul's demand for adulthood. There is another aspect, darker still. Sometimes the empath's snapping reveals not only their own shadow, but the shadow of the collective, because they absorb so much, because they live as vessels of others' unspoken emotions. When they break, they release not only their own rage, but the rage of many. They become the mouthpiece of the unconscious of their family, their community, even their culture. This is why their snapping can seem disproportionate, apocalyptic. They are not only screaming their own scream, they are screaming the scream of generations. In this sense, the empath's snapping is an eruption of collective shadow. And this is what makes it terrifying to those who witness it. They are not only confronted with one individual's rage, but with the archetypal rage of humanity itself, the rage of the oppressed, the silenced, the sacrificed. The empath becomes the vessel of a storm larger than themselves. I recall another patient, a man this time whose life was one of endless giving. He supported his siblings, his friends, even strangers, always lending money, always listening, always present, yet his dreams were filled with images of blood-soaked altars, of ancient priests sacrificing animals, of himself standing with a knife raised over his own chest. When he snapped, it was sudden and catastrophic. He vanished from his life, leaving debts unpaid, relationships abandoned, responsibilities forsaken. For months he wandered Europe, drinking heavily, lashing out at strangers, engaging in dangerous affairs. His family called him possessed, and in a sense they were right. He was possessed by the collective archetype of sacrifice. For years he had carried the unconscious of his family, their failures, their sorrows, their fears. When he snapped, he threw it all back into the world with violent defiance. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also necessary. Without it, he would have died by inches. With it, he faced the possibility of rebirth, though at great cost. So what is to be done? How does one walk the narrow path between endless self-sacrifice and catastrophic snapping? The answer is integration. The empath must learn to integrate the shadow before it erupts. They must learn to say no, not only in action, but in their very soul. They must face the wolf in their dreams and acknowledge it as their own. They must honor their anger as holy, their refusal as sacred, their boundaries as acts of love. Without this, they remain doomed to live as saints until they become demons. With this, they may live as whole human beings, both light and shadow, both healer and warrior. I tell you this with solemnity. The empath snapping is one of the most terrifying cases I have ever witnessed, but it is also one of the most profound revelations of the human psyche. It shows us that no mask can endure forever. No repression lasts without consequence. No archetype lives in the light without carrying its darkness. To deny this truth is to live in illusion. To face it is to step into the mystery of wholeness. When the empath snaps, the world trembles. Yet, after the storm passes, something remains, something raw, unsettled, broken open. This is the most perilous stage, for here the ego stands disoriented, uncertain of who it is. The persona of the saint, the caretaker, the perpetual giver has been shattered, but the new identity has not yet been born. It is here that the possibility of transformation arises, though it comes wrapped in danger. For if one flees back into the old mask, the snapping will only repeat with greater violence. If one collapses into despair, the psyche may fragment entirely, but if one endures, if one dares to stand in the ruins of the old self and listen, something extraordinary begins to take shape. This is the path of individuation, the road to wholeness, and it is lit by the very fire that once seemed destructive. Individuation is not the pursuit of perfection, but of completeness. It is not about becoming good, but about becoming whole. For the empath, this means embracing the shadow they once denied, their anger, their desire, their capacity for refusal and destruction. To integrate these is to reclaim the fullness of their humanity. The empath who has snapped stands before the threshold of this task. They must not turn away. They must not say, "That rage was not me." They must say instead, "That rage is mine, and I must learn its meaning." Only then can the snapping become initiation rather than collapse. Consider again the archetypal imagery. When Inanna returned from the underworld, she was not the same goddess who descended. She had faced her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of death, and in that encounter, she became sovereign in a new way. When Christ descended into hell, it was not to be destroyed, but to claim victory over death itself. The empath snapping is their descent, their confrontation with Ereshkigal, the harrowing of hell. If they return, they carry with them not only compassion but also power. They are no longer the perpetual victim of others' needs, but the conscious wielder of their own soul's fire. This is the paradox. The empath who snaps may, if they integrate, become a healer of greater depth than before, for they now know both light and darkness. The process of integration begins in the small, almost imperceptible acts of daily life. The empaths must learn to say no to what drains them, yes to what nourishes them. They must allow themselves to feel anger without rushing to transmute it into kindness. They must set boundaries not as acts of cruelty, but as expressions of truth. Each refusal becomes a sacred ritual. Each moment of self-assertion, a step toward individuation. The shadow does not disappear. It becomes a companion. The wolf that once tore at the door now walks beside them, guarding the threshold of their soul. This is the alchemical transformation. The poisonous lead of repressed rage becomes the protective gold of conscious strength. Dreams guide this process. After the snapping, the empath's dreams often shift. No longer filled with floods and fire alone, they begin to show images of balance. The wolf and the lamb drinking from the same stream, the broken house rebuilt with stronger foundations, the empath standing in a circle of both friends and adversaries, unshaken. These dreams reveal that the unconscious is supporting the integration, offering symbols of wholeness. Yet the ego must cooperate. To ignore such dreams is to risk regression. To honor them is to walk steadily towards the self. The self, as I have spoken often, is the archetype of totality, the image of God within the soul. For the empath, the snapping is often the first true encounter with the self, for it strips away the illusions of being only light, only good, only selfless. The self demands wholeness, not purity. It demands that we embrace the opposites, that we recognize in ourselves both the angel and the demon, the healer and the destroyer. When the empath confronts this truth, they stand at the heart of the mystery of being human. They begin to understand that love without boundaries is not love, that compassion without power is weakness, that giving without limit is not holiness but self-erasure. The self calls them to balance, to live as a complete person, not as an archetypal fragment. There is also a collective dimension to this transformation. As I said, the empath often carries not only their own emotions, but the unconscious burdens of others. When they snap, they release not only personal rage, but the rage of the collective. If they integrate this, they can become a guide for others, showing how to carry the weight of the world without drowning in it. They become what the shamans of old were, wounded healers, those who have descended into madness and returned with wisdom. Their snapping becomes not only their salvation, but the community's, for they embody a path that others may follow. But this requires that they endure the terror of their own shadow without projecting it outward, without fleeing into denial, without collapsing into despair. I must return here to the danger, for it is real. Not every empath who snaps finds the path of individuation. Some remain lost in bitterness, clinging to the rage as though it were their only identity. They become destroyers, unable to return to love. Others collapse back into the old persona, terrified of their own power. And the cycle repeats until their body itself breaks under the strain. This is why analysis, reflection, and conscious work are essential. One must not interpret the snapping as either total liberation or total doom. It is neither. It is an opening, a rupture that reveals what was hidden. What one does with that opening determines everything. The woman I told you about, the nurse who left her mother's house, came in time to embody this integration. She began to paint something she had denied herself for years. In her paintings, she allowed her shadow to appear. Dark forests, stormy seas, figures with torn faces. She did not censor this expression, and in doing so, she found relief. She also began to speak more directly, even bluntly, with those around her. Some relationships ended, but the ones that remained became deeper, more honest. Her colleagues no longer saw her as endlessly available, but they respected her boundaries. Over time, her sense of self shifted. She no longer defined herself as the one who saves. She began to define herself as the one who lives fully, who gives and receives, who feels both rage and tenderness. This was individuation. This was a goal that emerged from the snapping. My friends, let me tell you a secret. What terrifies you most about yourself is often the very thing that will set you free. The empath fears their own rage, their own refusal, their own selfishness. They fear becoming what they despise. But the truth is that these are not demons to be exorcised, but energies to be integrated. To feel anger is not to be cruel, it is to be alive. To refuse is not to betray, it is to honor. To claim space is not to abandon love, it is to make love sustainable. The snapping is terrifying because it forces the empath to see this truth in raw form without preparation. But if they accept it, if they say yes to the wolf, yes to the fire, yes to the shadow, then they emerge whole. And wholeness is more powerful, more beautiful, more terrifying than any mask of endless giving. The empath snapping then is both a death and a birth. It is the death of the false self, the persona of saintly sacrifice. It is the birth of the true self, the human being who contains both shadow and light. To witness this birth is to feel awe, for it is archetypal, it is mythic, it is sacred. But birth is always accompanied by blood, by cries, by pain. One cannot be reborn without passing through the agony of the snapping. And so I say to you, do not fear the breaking, but do not take it lightly. Enter it as one would enter a temple, trembling with reverence, for in that breaking, the God within you is revealed. When we speak of the empath snapping, we are really speaking of a death and resurrection mystery. Every ancient culture knew that transformation requires death. Osiris dismembered and scattered, Dionysus torn apart by the Titans, Christ crucified, Odin hanging 9 nights upon the world tree. These myths do not glorify destruction, but they reveal its necessity. To enter wholeness, something must break, must fall, must dissolve. The empath snapping is their crucifixion, their descent, their scattering, and if they endure, it is also their resurrection, their rebirth into a more complete form. But rebirth is not simple. The empath does not emerge as a triumphant hero untouched by scars. They emerge humbled, scarred, forever aware of the shadow that walks beside them. And this humility is itself sacred. For before, they thought themselves angelic, saintly, above rage and darkness. After, They know themselves to be human, woven of light and shadow alike. This humility is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the recognition that every act of compassion contains within it the seed of power, every act of love, the seed of possession, every act of sacrifice, the seed of resentment. To live with this awareness is to live truthfully, without illusion. I have seen empaths who, after their snapping, come to embody a strange serenity. It is not the false calm of repression, but the deep calm of one who has looked into the abyss and returned. Their presence is different. When they say yes, it is wholehearted, not coerced. When they say no, it is firm, without guilt. They no longer give out of compulsion, but out of choice. Their compassion is no longer a mask of survival, but a conscious act of love. And others feel this difference. Their relationships deepen, for they are no longer based on silent martyrdom, but on truth. They may lose many who depended on their endless giving, but they gain those who respect their wholeness. In this way, the empath snapping becomes the foundation of a new life. The archetypal imagery of rebirth appears in their dreams. Where once there were floods and fires, now there are green shoots, blooming trees, children playing in fields. Where once there were wolves tearing, now there are wolves standing as guardians. The psyche itself affirms the transformation, for the unconscious is not our enemy, it is our ally. Even when it terrifies us, the snapping was the unconscious breaking through with unbearable force, but now in integration. The unconscious offers symbols of healing. It says, "You have faced death, now here's life. You have embraced rage, now here is peace. You have admitted shadow, now here is light." Yet even here we must remain vigilant, for individuation is never complete. The snapping may return in new forms if the lessons are not lived. One cannot simply have snapped once and imagine the work is done. Life is a spiral, and the shadow returns at deeper levels. The empath who has integrated their rage must remain attentive, must continue to honor boundaries, to listen to dreams, to practice truth. If they do not, the persona may rebuild itself in subtler ways, and the snapping may come again, fiercer, more destructive. The work of wholeness is lifelong, but once one has faced the snapping consciously, there is less to fear, for the abyss once crossed is no longer infinite. Now let me speak to you directly. If you recognize yourself in these words, if you feel the tremor of snapping within your soul, do not flee, do not numb yourself with endless distractions, nor silence yourself with false kindness. Turn inward, look at your shadow, admit your rage, your exhaustion, your longing for freedom. Admit that you cannot carry the world, that you are not here to save everyone, that your worth is not in your giving. This admission will feel like death, but it is the seed of life. And if you have already snapped, if you have already broken and left behind the ruins of your old life, do not despair. You are not lost. You are in the underworld, and the underworld is not the end. It is the womb of transformation. Stay there. Listen. Let the old self die, and the new self will rise. In this way, The empath's most terrifying case becomes also the most profound teaching. It shows us that compassion without shadow is an illusion, that giving without boundaries is destruction, that light without darkness is incomplete. It reveals that the soul demands wholeness, even if it must break us to achieve it. And it invites us to honor the snapping, not as failure, but as initiation. For initiation always begins in terror. The shaman is torn apart before they are healed. The hero is swallowed before they emerge. The empath snaps before they are made whole. This is the mystery. This is the law of the psyche. This is the archetype that lives in us all. And so I leave you with this vision. Imagine standing before a mirror that reflects not only your face, but your shadow, your rage, your pain. You do not turn away. You gaze into it, and you say, yes, this too is me. In that moment, the mirror shatters, and you are free. Not free to escape yourself, but free to be yourself fully. This is the gift hidden in the snapping. It is the most terrifying case, yes, but also the most sacred, for it is the birth of the self, and the self is the God within, the wholeness that holds all opposites, the eternal light that shines even in the darkest abyss. Do not fear the snapping, my friends. Fear only the life that never dares to break. For it is better to shatter once and be reborn whole than to remain unbroken and live forever in fragments.